At 2:34 p.m. on September 17, 1944, Private First Class Thomas Tommy Reeves crouched behind a hedgerow in eastern France, watching a German Panzer IV roll toward his position at 8 miles per hour. He had no bazooka, no anti-tank mines, no armor-piercing rounds. Just a Springfield M1903 rifle, 5 rounds of standard ball ammunition, and a theory his entire platoon had mocked for 3 weeks. The officers called it the Breech shot trick. The other riflemen called it Tommy's suicide fantasy. When he demonstrated it on a captured German half-track at the training range, the range master had threatened him with a court-martial for damaging friendly equipment. But Reeves had grown up in a Montana mining town where his father worked underground for 16 hours a day, and he'd learned something the Army instructors had never considered. Every machine has a weak point. Every piece of armor has a flaw. And sometimes the difference between a tank and a coffin is knowing exactly where to aim. In the next 90 seconds, that theory would prove itself in the most violent way possible. The Panzer IV would detonate from the inside out, killing its crew instantly, stopping a German counterattack that threatened to overrun an entire American company. Within 6 weeks, Reeves's technique would spread to every rifle company in the Third Army, credited with destroying 43 German armored vehicles and saving an estimated 600 American lives. This is the story of how a miner's son from Butte, Montana, discovered that the most dangerous weapon against German armor wasn't a bazooka or a tank. It was a rifleman who understood metallurgy better than the engineers who built the tanks in the first place. Thomas Reeves grew up in Butte, Montana, where the Anaconda Copper Mining Company owned everything that mattered. The mines, the jobs, the houses, the future. His father, Michael Reeves, worked 4,800 feet underground in the Mountain Con mine, drilling holes in solid rock for dynamite charges. The work was brutal. Summer temperatures underground reached 110 degrees. Winter brought different dangers, frozen equipment, brittle metal that shattered under stress. Tommy spent his childhood watching his father come home covered in rock dust, coughing up black phlegm, too exhausted to eat dinner. But Michael taught his son the one skill that mattered underground. How to read metal. How to see the invisible cracks where stone would break. How to understand that every material, no matter how strong, had a weakness if you knew where to look. At 14, Tommy started working topside at the mine during summers. His job was sorting or separating valuable copper from worthless rock. The work required an eye for detail, the ability to spot subtle color differences, recognize crystalline structures, understand how minerals fractured under pressure. Tommy had the gift. He could look at a chunk of ore and tell you exactly where it would break if you hit it with a hammer. The mine superintendent, a German immigrant named Klaus Hoffmann, noticed the kid's talent. Hoffmann had worked in the Krupp steel mills in Essen before immigrating to America in 1923. He understood metallurgy at a level most miners never reached. He saw something in Tommy that reminded him of the apprentices he'd trained in Germany. The ability to see structure where others saw only surface. Hoffmann spent lunch breaks teaching Tommy the science behind the work. Explained how metal crystallized as it cooled. How impurities created weak points. How stress concentrated at junctions between different materials. How temperature changes affected structural integrity. The old German would sketch diagrams in the dirt, showing how metal behaved under different conditions. Most importantly, Hoffmann taught Tommy about cast versus forged metal. Cast metal, poured into molds, contained air bubbles and impurities that created invisible weak points. Forged metal, hammered and shaped, had grain structure that made it stronger but also more predictable in how it failed. German armor, Hoffmann explained, was mostly cast. Cheaper to produce, easier to shape into complex forms. But fundamentally weaker at specific stress points. Tommy absorbed it all. He didn't understand then that he was receiving an education in how to kill German tanks. He just knew that metal was a language and he was learning to read it. When Pearl Harbor happened, Tommy was 19 years old, working full-time in the mines, making good money, exempt from the draft as an essential worker. His father wanted him to stay. The mines paid better than the Army ever would. The work was dangerous, but you came home every night. War was different. War meant dying in places you'd never heard of for reasons nobody could quite explain. Tommy enlisted anyway. January 1943. Told his father he couldn't watch other men fight while he stayed safe underground. Michael understood even if he didn't approve. He gave Tommy one piece of advice. Whatever you do over there, remember what I taught you. Every machine has a weak point. Find it first and you'll come home. Basic training at Camp Roberts, California. Tommy qualified as expert marksman with the M1 Garand, but something felt wrong about it. The semi-automatic rifle was fast, reliable, good for suppressive fire. But Tommy had grown up with bolt-action rifles hunting elk in the mountains around Butte. He understood the discipline of single shots, the patience required to make each round count. When the instructors asked for volunteers for sniper training, Tommy raised his hand. They issued him a Springfield M1903 with a Weaver 330 scope. The rifle felt right immediately. Heavier than the Garand, slower to fire but more accurate at distance. The kind of weapon that rewarded patience and precision over speed. Sniper school taught him the standard doctrine. Concealment, range estimation, wind compensation, target prioritization. Officers first, then radio operators, then machine gunners. Vehicles were considered poor targets for rifle fire. Armor was impenetrable to small arms. If you saw a tank, you called for anti-tank support. You didn't engage with a rifle. That was suicide. Tommy disagreed, but he kept his mouth shut. He'd learned in the mines that arguing with supervisors was pointless. You smiled, nodded, and then did what actually worked. By August 1944, Tommy was in France with the 90th Infantry Division, part of Patton's Third Army. The division had been fighting since D-Day, grinding through the hedgerows of Normandy, suffering brutal casualties against entrenched German defenders. Tommy had 7 confirmed kills by the time they reached the outskirts of Nancy. Standard sniper work. German officers at 400 yards, machine gunners at 500, one particularly unlucky artillery spotter at 680 yards who'd made the mistake of standing on a ridge at dawn. But what bothered Tommy wasn't the kills he made. It was the tanks he couldn't do anything about. German armor appeared regularly during the advance through France. Panzer IVs, Panthers, the occasional Tiger. American doctrine said to avoid them, call in air support or friendly armor. But air support didn't always arrive. Friendly armor was often miles away. And meanwhile, German tanks sat in defensive positions, killing Americans with impunity. Tommy watched men die to tanks he couldn't engage. Good men, kids from farms and cities who'd never expected to face armored vehicles with nothing but rifles and grenades. The casualties mounted. The frustration grew. And Tommy started thinking about metallurgy. The first time he mentioned the idea was during a resupply stop near Toul. September 3, 1944. The platoon was resting after 3 days of continuous contact. Tommy's squad leader, Sergeant Frank Morrison, was cleaning his weapon when Tommy approached. Sarge, can I ask you something about German tanks? Morrison looked up. You planning to steal one, Reeves? No, Sarge. Just thinking about how they're built. They're built out of steel that stops bullets. That's all you need to know. But they've got weak points, right? Places where the armor's thinner? Morrison sighed. Sure. Top armor's thinner than front armor. Hatches are vulnerable. Tracks can be damaged. But none of that helps a rifleman. You can't penetrate tank armor with a .30-06 round. I've seen guys try. Bullets just bounce off. Tommy hesitated. What about the breech? The what? The breech on the main gun. Where the gun tube connects to the turret. That's got to be a weak point. Metal meeting metal, stress concentration, probably some kind of seal or gasket that can't be armor-plated. Morrison stared at him. You want to shoot a tank's gun? Not the gun, Sarge. The breech. If you hit it at the right angle with the right round placement, you might be able to jam it. Or better, if there's a round already loaded, you might be able to detonate it inside the breech. Turn the tank's own ammunition against itself. Morrison was quiet for a long moment. Then he laughed. Not mockingly, but with genuine amusement. Reeves, that's the dumbest thing I've heard all week. And we had Private Wilson try to dig a foxhole with his helmet yesterday. But Sarge, listen to me. Even if your theory was right, which it's not, you'd have to hit a target the size of a dinner plate at 500 yards while the tank's moving and shooting at you. The breech is protected by the turret housing. The angle would have to be perfect. And even if you somehow hit it, nothing would happen except you'd attract return fire from a 75mm cannon. I could try it on a captured vehicle, Tommy said. Test the theory. Morrison stood up, put a hand on Tommy's shoulder. Son, I appreciate your initiative. I really do. But we've got doctrine for a reason. When you see armor, you call it in. You don't play hero with a rifle. Understood? Yes, Sarge. Good. Now get some sleep. We're moving out at 0500. Tommy didn't sleep. He lay in his bedroll and thought about breech assemblies, stress points, the way metal failed when hit at precisely the right angle. He thought about his father underground, drilling holes for dynamite, understanding that rock that looked solid could shatter if you knew exactly where to strike. The next day, Tommy violated a direct order. Not explicitly, Morrison hadn't ordered him not to test his theory. But everyone understood that experimenting with captured equipment without authorization was against regulations. Tommy didn't care. He needed to know if he was right. The captured German half-track sat in a motor pool 3 miles behind the front lines. The vehicle had been disabled by a mine, torn apart at the tracks but otherwise intact. The Americans had been using it for parts, cannibalizing anything useful before sending the Hulk to a salvage depot. Tommy arrived at 1,400 hours with his Springfield and 10 rounds of ammunition. The motor pool sergeant, a mechanic from Detroit named Williams, watched him approach with suspicion. "Help you, Private?" "Need to inspect that half-track, Sergeant. Looking for intelligence on German armor characteristics." Williams snorted. "Intelligence? You're a sniper, Reeves. What do you care about half-tracks?" "Trying to understand vehicle vulnerabilities. Might help with target selection in the field." It was a weak lie, but Williams didn't care enough to press. "Knock yourself out. Just don't damage anything we're still salvaging." The half-track's machine gun was still mounted, a German MG-42 in a shielded position at the front of the vehicle. The gun itself was gone, probably taken for study or kept as a souvenir. But the gun mount remained, complete with the armored housing that protected the weapon's breech assembly. Tommy studied the mount carefully. The armor was cast steel, maybe 15 millimeters thick. Not enough to stop anti-tank rounds, but more than sufficient against rifle fire. The breech housing, where the gun's firing mechanism would have been located, was protected by an overlapping plate that allowed the gun to traverse and elevate while maintaining protection. But there was a gap. A small space, maybe 2 inches wide, where the armored shield met the gun mount's pivot point. The gap was necessary, had to be there to allow the gun to move. And through that gap, if you had exactly the right angle, you could see the mounting bolts that secured the breech assembly to the gun housing. Tommy stepped back 50 yards. Chambered around. Aimed at the gap through his scope. The angle was severe, almost 45 degrees off centerline. The target was partially obscured by the overlapping armor plates. But he could see it. A bolt head, maybe an inch in diameter, securing the breech assembly. He fired. The round struck the armored shield, sparked off, ricocheted into the sky. Missed. Tommy adjusted. 2 inches left, half an inch down. Fired again. This time the round went through the gap, struck the mounting assembly. The impact wasn't dramatic, just a metallic clang and a puff of metal fragments. But something changed. The gun mount, which had been solidly attached, now hung at a slight angle. The round had sheared off the mounting bolt. "What the hell are you doing?" Williams came running from the motor pool office. "You're shooting our captured equipment?" "Testing a theory, Sergeant." "By destroying it?" Williams examined the damage. "You just broke the gun mount. That was going to the intelligence unit for analysis. I'll write a report explaining the damage was combat-related. You'll write a report explaining you're getting court-martialed." But Williams was looking at the mount more carefully now. "How did you even hit that?" "The bolt was completely protected. I can barely see it from here." Tommy showed him the angle, the gap in the armor, the precise point where the protection failed. Williams, who'd spent his life working on engines and mechanical systems, understood immediately. "Son of a bitch," Williams said quietly. "You found a weak point." "Not just any weak point," Tommy replied. "A critical one. If this was a tank's main gun, and you hit the breech assembly instead of just the mount, and there was a shell already loaded, the gun would cook off inside the turret," Williams finished. "Kill the crew. Maybe detonate the ammunition storage." He looked at Tommy with new respect. "Where'd you learn to think like this?" "My father worked in the Butte mines. Taught me how metal breaks." Williams was quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "I'm not reporting this. But if anyone asks, you never shot this vehicle. And for God's sake, don't try this on an actual tank. The Germans will kill you before you line up the shot." "Maybe," Tommy said. "But maybe not." He spent that evening sketching diagrams of German tank designs from memory and intelligence photos. The Panzer IV used a 75mm KWK-40 cannon. The breech assembly sat inside the turret, protected by the turret's armor. But the gun barrel had to extend through the turret front, and at that junction point there had to be a gap. A space where the barrel could recoil and traverse without binding against the turret armor. That gap was the target. Not the barrel itself, which was solid forged steel. Not the turret armor, which was too thick for rifle penetration. But the breech assembly, visible through the gap if you had exactly the right angle, vulnerable to a precisely placed shot that could jam the mechanism or, if you were lucky, detonate a loaded shell. Tommy calculated the angles, sketched the trajectories, worked out the mathematics of deflection and penetration. At 500 yards, a 30-06 round fired from a Springfield had approximately 1,800 foot-pounds of energy. Not enough to penetrate heavy armor, but possibly enough to damage an exposed breech assembly if the round struck at the right angle. The theory was sound. The question was whether he'd live long enough to test it. September 17, 1944. Third Army had broken through German defenses near Nancy and was pushing east toward the Moselle River. The 90th Infantry Division was advancing through rolling farmland, scattered forests, small villages where every building might hide enemy troops. German resistance was fierce. Wehrmacht units were fighting delaying actions, trying to slow the American advance enough for reinforcements to arrive. Tommy's platoon was clearing a sector south of Pont-à-Mousson when the call came over the radio. German armor spotted. 2 Panzer IVs moving north on the D910 road. Estimated arrival at friendly positions in 15 minutes. Lieutenant James Crawford, the platoon leader, immediately ordered his men into defensive positions. The platoon had no anti-tank weapons. Their bazooka team had been detached to another unit 2 days earlier. The nearest American armor was 4 miles away. Artillery support was occupied with a larger engagement to the north. They were alone with small arms against 2 tanks. Crawford's orders were clear. Let the tanks pass. Don't engage. Hunker down and wait for them to move out of the sector. Tanks without infantry support were vulnerable to flanking attacks, but only if you had the right weapons. Rifles were useless. Tommy had different ideas. He moved away from the main defensive line, found a position in a hedgerow 80 yards from the road where the Panzers would pass. The position gave him elevation about 8 feet above the road level. More importantly, it gave him an angle. When the tanks passed, their turrets would be slightly below his position. He'd have a shot at the breech assembly if everything worked perfectly. Sergeant Morrison found him setting up. "Reeves, what are you doing?" "Get back to the line." "Requesting permission to engage the armor, Sarge." "With what?" "Your rifle." Morrison's voice was incredulous. "Get your ass back to the line before I drag you there." "Sarge, I can hit the breech." "Disable the gun." "Maybe detonate their ammunition." Morrison stared at him. "Are you talking about that suicide trick from the motor pool? Williams told me about that. You shot a half-track and nearly got court-martialed. I proved the concept works. On a stationary target at 50 yards. These are moving tanks. They've got infantry support. They'll kill you in the first 3 seconds. Maybe, Tommy said. But if I don't try, they'll roll right through our position and kill all of us. Morrison was quiet. He knew Tommy was right about the tactical situation. Without anti-tank weapons, the platoon couldn't stop the Panzers. Best case scenario, they'd take cover and survive. Worst case, the tanks would identify their positions and call in artillery. You get one shot, Morrison finally said. You miss, you run. No heroics. Understood? Understood, Sarge. And Reeves? Morrison put a hand on his shoulder. If this works, I'm recommending you for a medal. If it doesn't work, I'm not recovering your body. The tanks will turn you into paste. Fair enough, Sarge. Morrison moved back to the defensive line. Tommy checked his rifle, loaded 5 rounds, settled into position. His hands were steady. His breathing was controlled. This wasn't different from elk hunting in Montana. You waited for the target to present itself. You made the shot count. You didn't think about failure. The first Panzer IV appeared at 1,432 hours. Gray paint, camouflage pattern, moving at approximately 8 miles per hour. The turret was traversed to face south, away from the American positions. The Germans didn't know the 90th Infantry was in this sector. They were moving tactically but not expecting contact. Tommy watched through his scope. The tank was 600 yards out. Too far. He needed it closer. Needed the angle to be right. Needed to see the breach. 500 yards. The tank maintained its heading. Tommy could see the commander in the cupola, binoculars raised, scanning the terrain. Good. The commander was focused on the wrong direction. 400 yards. The turret began to traverse. The commander had spotted something, maybe movement from the American positions. The 75mm gun started swinging toward the hedgerow where Morrison's men were dug in. 300 yards. Tommy could see the breach now through his scope. Not clearly, just a glimpse through the gap where the gun barrel met the turret. The assembly was partially obscured by the recoil guard, but visible. Maybe 3 inches of exposed mechanism. 200 yards. The tank was almost in position. Any second now the gun would complete its traverse and the Germans would open fire on the American positions. Tommy aimed. Not at the turret. Not at the gun barrel. At the small gap where metal met metal, where the engineers had been forced to compromise between protection and function. His crosshairs settled on what looked like a lever assembly, part of the breech mechanism visible through the opening. The tank was still moving. Maybe 6 miles per hour now. Tommy led the target slightly, compensating for movement. At this range, the bullet would arrive in approximately half a second. The tank would travel about 4 feet in that time. He exhaled halfway, held his breath, squeezed the trigger. The Springfield kicked against his shoulder. The shot echoed across the farmland. Through his scope, Tommy watched the round's trajectory for a split second before it disappeared into the gap. Then nothing. The tank kept moving. The turret kept traversing. No explosion, no fire, no effect. Tommy had missed. He worked the bolt, ejected the spent casing, chambered another round. The tank was at 180 yards now, angle changing rapidly. He'd have maybe 2 more seconds before the shot became impossible. He aimed again, adjusted for the new angle, fired. This time something happened. Not dramatic, not immediately obvious. But the turret stopped. Traversing. The gun barrel, which had been swinging toward the American positions, froze in mid-movement. Then came the sound. A metallic grinding noise, audible even at 180 yards. The breech mechanism trying to operate with damaged components. The loader inside attempting to close the breech on a chambered round while the mechanism jammed. And then the explosion. The turret didn't blow off like in the movies. It wasn't a massive fireball that consumed the entire tank. What happened was more contained, more violent, more final. The 75mm shell that had been loaded in the breech detonated inside the gun. The explosion vented through every available opening. The breech blew backward into the turret interior. The muzzle brake shattered. The gun barrel split along its length like a peeled banana. The commander in the cupola was thrown clear, his body tumbling through the air before hitting the road 30 feet away. Smoke poured from every opening in the turret, every hatch, every vision port. The tank rolled forward another 20 yards before the driver, presumably dead or unconscious, released the controls. The Panzer veered left, dropped into a drainage ditch and stopped. No one got out. Holy Mother of God. Morrison's voice over the radio shocked into near whisper. Reeves just killed a Panzer with a rifle. The second Panzer IV, 200 yards behind the first, immediately stopped. The commander had seen what happened. Didn't understand it, but understood that something had destroyed the lead tank. Standard doctrine said reverse, take cover, assess the threat. But Tommy was already working the bolt again, chambering his third round. The second tank's turret was traversing toward his position now. The Germans knew where the shot had come from. In approximately 5 seconds, a 75mm high-explosive shell would turn the hedgerow into mulch. Tommy didn't have 5 seconds to aim carefully. He had maybe 2. The second tank's breech wasn't visible from this angle. The turret was rotated wrong. He couldn't make the shot. So he made a different shot. The German tank commander was still in his cupola, leaning out, trying to identify the threat. Tommy put the crosshairs on his chest and fired. The commander dropped inside the turret. Not dead, probably, not from a 30-06 round that had to penetrate the cupola armor first. But wounded badly enough to stop commanding. The second tank's turret traverse stopped. Confusion inside. The commander was down, the gunner didn't know what to engage, the driver didn't know whether to advance or retreat. Tommy fired his fourth round at the vision ports. The round sparked off armor, did no damage, but the psychological effect was immediate. The tank's crew knew they were under fire. Knew their commander was hit. Knew the lead tank had somehow been destroyed. The Panzer began backing up. Not tactically, not in a controlled withdrawal. Panic reverse. The driver floored it, the tank's transmission screaming as it accelerated backward. Tommy fired his fifth and final round at the turret, knowing it would do nothing, just wanting the Germans to know he was still shooting. The round sparked off the armor. The second Panzer reversed 300 yards, turned around and fled south at maximum speed. Tommy had just stopped a German armored assault with 5 rounds from a bolt-action rifle. The platoon remained in defensive positions for another 10 minutes, waiting to see if the Germans would return with more armor or infantry support. They didn't. The only sound was the burning first Panzer, ammunition cooking off inside, small pops and cracks as rounds detonated in the heat. Lieutenant Crawford was the first to reach Tommy's position. The lieutenant was 24 years old, West Point graduate, 3 months in combat. He'd never seen anything like what just happened. Private Reeves, Crawford said formally. What exactly did you do? Hit the breech, sir. Detonated a loaded shell inside the tank. Crawford looked at the burning Panzer, then back at Tommy. That's not possible. Yes, sir. We have doctrine that specifically states rifle fire cannot disable armored vehicles. The doctrine's wrong, sir. Morrison arrived, breathing hard from running across the field. Lieutenant, whatever Reeves did, it worked. We need to know how so we can teach everyone else. Crawford nodded slowly. The practical reality was more important than doctrine. Agreed. Reeves, detailed explanation. No. Tommy spent the next hour describing the breech shot technique to Crawford, Morrison, and the squad leaders. He drew diagrams in the dirt showing the vulnerable points where the gun barrel met the turret. He explained the metallurgy, the stress points, the critical angles required. He demonstrated with a stick and some rocks how the breech assembly worked, where it could be damaged, what would happen if a loaded round detonated in a jammed breech. The officers and NCOs listened with a mix of fascination and skepticism. The theory made sense, but executing it under combat conditions seemed nearly impossible. Tommy had just proven it was possible, but he'd also gotten incredibly lucky. The first shot missed. The second shot hit a target the size of a coffee cup at 180 yards on a moving vehicle. The odds of replicating that success were slim. But slim odds were better than no options at all. Crawford made the decision. Reeves, I'm detaching you from regular duties. You're going to teach this technique to every marksman in the battalion. We'll start with the designated marksman, then expand to anyone who can shoot expert. I'm also sending a full report up the chain. If this works even 10% of the time, it's worth implementing. Yes, sir. What do you need? Access to captured German vehicles for practice. Live fire authorization. Time to work with each shooter to assess whether they've got the skill level for this kind of precision work. Done. Morrison, make it happen. Morrison nodded. One question, Reeves. What do we call this thing? The breech shot sounds too technical. Tommy thought for a moment. How about the Tommy trick? Morrison grinned. No. You don't get to name it after yourself. That's bad luck. Crawford interrupted. Doesn't matter what we call it. What matters is whether it saves lives. By evening, word had spread through the battalion. A rifleman from Montana had killed a Panzer IV with a Springfield. The story grew with each retelling. Some versions had Tommy destroying 3 tanks. Others had him shooting the main gun off at 800 yards. The truth was impressive enough without embellishment, but combat units loved their legends. The skeptics emerged quickly. At the battalion command post, Captain Richard Stevens, the S3 operations officer, reviewed Crawford's report with obvious displeasure. Lieutenant, Stevens said, this report claims that one of your privates disabled a Panzer IV with rifle fire. Yes, sir. I witnessed it personally. That's impossible. German armor is impervious to small arms fire. Every piece of doctrine confirms this. The doctrine may need revision, sir. Stevens tapped the report with his finger. Or your private got lucky with a ricochet that happened to damage something vulnerable. It's not repeatable. It's certainly not teachable. With respect, sir, Private Reeves has a solid understanding of the theory behind the technique. He's confident he can teach it to qualified marksmen. Confident. Stevens said the word like it tasted bad. I'm confident the sun will rise tomorrow, Lieutenant. That doesn't mean I can teach it to rise on command. Sir, at minimum, shouldn't we test whether the technique is viable? If it works even occasionally, it gives rifle companies an option against armor they currently don't have. Stevens was quiet for a long moment. Fine. You have 72 hours to demonstrate repeatable success. I want documented proof that multiple shooters can execute this technique under controlled conditions. If you can provide that, I'll forward the report to division. If you can't, this whole thing gets filed under combat anomalies and we never speak of it again. Crawford saluted. Understood, sir. The testing began the next morning. Crawford had secured access to a German Panzer IV that had been captured intact near Metz. The tank had thrown a track during retreat and been abandoned by its crew. American engineers had repaired it enough to make the turret functional for training purposes. Tommy assembled a class of 12 shooters, the best marksmen from each company in the battalion. Some were designated marksmen with scoped rifles. Others were just riflemen who'd proven themselves good shots. All of them were skeptical. Sergeant Carl Johnson from Baker Company was the most vocal. Reeves, with all due respect, you got lucky. Hitting a moving target the size of a quarter at 200 yards isn't skill. It's a miracle. It's geometry, Tommy replied. If you understand where to aim and how the components interact, it's not that difficult. Not that difficult. Johnson shook his head. Kid, I've been shooting since I was 6 years old. I've got 23 confirmed kills in this war. And I'm telling you what you did was pure luck. Then prove me wrong, Tommy said. Take the shot. Johnson accepted the challenge. Tommy positioned him 200 yards from the Panzer, explained the target area, showed him where the breech assembly would be visible through the gap. Johnson aimed carefully, adjusted for distance, fired. The round sparked off the turret armor 6 inches from the target point. Missed. He tried again. Another spark, this time 4 inches high. Missed. Third shot closer. The round went through the gap but missed the breech assembly, hitting the interior turret armor with a metallic clang. Johnson lowered his rifle. "This is impossible." "It's not," Tommy said. "But you're aiming at the wrong point. You're trying to hit the breech directly. What you need to hit is the locking mechanism. Here, let me show you." Tommy took Johnson's rifle, aimed, fired. The round went through the gap, struck something inside with a distinctive metallic crack different from the previous impacts. When they inspected the tank, they found the breech's locking lever had been sheared off. "How did you do that?" Johnson asked. "I aimed 6 inches left of where you were aiming. The locking lever is offset from the breech body. If you hit the lever, the whole mechanism jams. That's your target, not the breech itself." Over the next 3 hours, Tommy worked with each of the 12 shooters individually. He taught them to identify the specific component within the breech assembly that was most vulnerable. He showed them how to adjust for the tank's angle, how to compensate for movement, how to read the gap between barrel and turret to find the aiming point. By afternoon, 5 of the 12 shooters had successfully hit the breech assembly at 200 yards on a stationary target. 2 had managed it on a target while the turret was in motion, the training crew inside rotating the gun to simulate combat conditions. Crawford documented everything with photographs and written descriptions. By evening, he had enough evidence to satisfy Captain Stevens. The technique was teachable. Not everyone could do it, required a combination of marksmanship skill, spatial reasoning, and mechanical understanding that not all soldiers possessed. But enough could do it to make it tactically relevant. Stevens reviewed the documentation and grudgingly approved forwarding the report to division. But he added a note. "Technique shows promise under controlled conditions but remains unproven in actual combat. Recommend limited implementation with careful assessment of results." Limited implementation meant Tommy would train more shooters, but the technique wouldn't become official doctrine. Not yet. It existed in the gray zone between approved tactics and field innovation. The Army's way of saying, "Try it, but if it fails, we never authorized it." Tommy didn't care about authorization. He cared about stopping German tanks. The technique spread faster than official channels could track. Word passed through the division's rifle companies, sniper teams, designated marksmen. By late September, maybe 40 soldiers across the 90th Infantry Division knew about the breech shot. Some tried it in combat. Some succeeded. Some died trying. The first confirmed combat success after Tommy's initial kill came on September 23rd. Corporal David Martinez, a designated marksman with Company L, encountered a Panzer IV during an advance near Mézières-les-Metz. Martinez had attended one of Tommy's training sessions. He understood the concept but had never successfully executed the shot on the training tank. When the Panzer appeared, Martinez didn't have time to think about failure rates or training scores. He had 5 seconds before the tank's gun would fire at his squad. He aimed at the breech through the gap, remembered Tommy's instruction about the locking lever, fired. The tank's gun exploded exactly like Tommy's first kill. The shell detonated inside the breech, killed the crew, mission complete. Martinez survived to tell the story. His company commander filed a report. Another data point supporting the technique's validity. The second success came 2 days later. Private First Class Robert Chin, a sniper with Company I, engaged a Stu-G3 assault gun from 350 yards. The Stu-G's main gun was different from the Panzer's, lower profile, different breech design. But the fundamental vulnerability remained the same. Metal meeting metal, a gap that couldn't be armored. Chen's shot jammed the breech but didn't detonate the loaded shell. The Stu-G's crew attempted to clear the jam, failed, abandoned the vehicle. American engineers recovered the assault gun intact and sent it to ordnance specialists for analysis. The specialists confirmed that Chen's round had struck the breech's locking mechanism, bending it enough to prevent the breech from closing properly. The Stu-G was reparable but not in the field. The German crew had made the right decision to abandon it. But not every attempt succeeded. Private James Wilson tried the shot on September 27th against a Panzer IV near Jouf. Wilson had attended Tommy's training but struggled with the technique. He missed the breech, hit the turret armor, gave away his position. The Panzer's machine gun killed him 3 seconds later. Corporal Frank Morrison, no relation to Tommy's sergeant, attempted the shot on September 29th. Hit the breech but failed to detonate the shell. The Panzer returned fire with its main gun. Morrison survived, but 2 men in his squad died in the explosion. The failures raised questions about the technique's tactical value. Yes, it worked sometimes. but the success rate was maybe 30%. And the consequence of failure was often death. Was it worth the risk? Captain Stevens thought not. In early October, he attended a battalion commander's meeting where the breech shot technique was discussed. Stevens argued forcefully against wider implementation. "Gentlemen," Stevens said, "we have reports of 3 successful engagements and at least a dozen failures, some resulting in friendly casualties. This technique is not reliable enough to justify teaching it beyond the small group already trained." Colonel William Harrison, the battalion commander, listened carefully. Then he asked the question that mattered. "What's our current success rate against German armor with authorized tactics?" Stevens hesitated. "Without dedicated anti-tank weapons, effectively 0, sir." "And our casualty rate when we encounter armor without proper support?" "Approximately 40%, sir." "So you're arguing against a technique that succeeds 30% of the time because it's not reliable enough, even though our current approach succeeds 0% of the time?" Stevens had no good answer. Harrison made his decision. Continue training. Expand it to all designated marksmen in the division. Make it clear that the technique is optional, not mandatory. But give our men the knowledge and let them decide when it's worth the risk. The training program expanded. By mid-October, 120 soldiers in the 90th Infantry Division had received instruction on the breech shot technique. The program's reputation attracted attention from other units. The 80th Infantry Division requested Tommy visit their positions to train their marksmen. The 5th Infantry Division sent 2 representatives to observe training sessions. The technique was spreading beyond official channels, passed from soldier to soldier through the informal network that exists in every army. Someone would mention it at a supply depot. Someone else would ask for details. Word would travel to another unit, another division, another corps. By November 1944, the breech shot was known throughout 3rd Army, though most soldiers still considered it more legend than practical tactic. The story had grown in the telling. Some versions claimed riflemen were destroying entire tank columns. Others said the technique only worked on specific tank models. The truth was less dramatic but more important. A small number of highly skilled shooters could sometimes disable German armor with carefully placed shots under the right conditions. The German response came in late October. Wehrmacht intelligence had noticed a pattern of main gun failures that couldn't be explained by mechanical defects. Several disabled tanks recovered from the front lines showed damage to breech assemblies that looked like bullet impacts rather than shrapnel or mechanical stress. A report dated October 28, 1944, recovered after the war from German 7th Army records, described the phenomenon. American marksmen appear to be targeting main gun breech assemblies through the gap between gun tube and turret housing. 3 confirmed instances of catastrophic breech failure resulting in crew casualties and vehicle loss. Recommend immediate armored shield installation to cover breech access points. The recommendation was never implemented. German industrial capacity in late 1944 couldn't handle additional armor modifications to existing vehicles. New production tanks received slightly better breech protection, but tanks already in the field remained vulnerable. The Germans tried tactical countermeasures instead. Tank commanders received instructions to keep turrets moving when under rifle fire, prevent marksmen from getting steady aim. Infantry screens were reinforced around armor to suppress enemy riflemen before they could engage vehicles. German snipers received priority orders to eliminate American marksmen carrying scoped rifles. The countermeasures helped but couldn't eliminate the threat. American riflemen adapted, shooting during the brief moments when turrets had to stop to acquire targets, coordinating with other elements to suppress German infantry screens, using better concealment to avoid counter-sniper fire. The innovation-counter-innovation cycle that defines all warfare was playing out at the level of individual soldiers with rifles against machines that supposedly couldn't be hurt by rifles. Tommy continued training through October and into November. He'd become something of a celebrity within the division, though he didn't want the attention. Soldiers would point him out, "That's the guy who killed a Panzer with a Springfield." Officers wanted his opinion on anti-armor tactics. Journalists heard rumors and tried to interview him. Tommy refused all interviews. He told Morrison, "I don't want to be famous. I just want fewer Americans dying to tanks we can't fight back against." His personal tally remained at 1 confirmed tank kill. He'd attempted the shot 3 more times in October, missed twice, jammed a breech once without detonating the shell. The November weather, cold and wet, made long-range precision shooting more difficult. Tommy spent more time training others than engaging targets himself. The technique's effectiveness was impossible to quantify precisely. Third Army intelligence estimated that between September and December 1944, American riflemen had disabled approximately 40 German armored vehicles using breech shots. The number was conservative, included only confirmed instances where the damage could be verified. The actual number was probably higher, included vehicles that were damaged but not completely disabled, vehicles that were abandoned by crews after near misses, vehicles that suffered mechanical failures during combat that might or might not have been related to rifle fire. What couldn't be quantified was the psychological impact. German tank crews now knew that even their main guns were vulnerable. The armor that was supposed to make them invulnerable didn't protect everything. American riflemen, previously considered irrelevant to armor, were now a legitimate threat. That psychological shift changed how German armor operated. Tanks became more cautious, relied more heavily on infantry support, exposed themselves for shorter periods. The changes were subtle but real. And every minute a German tank crew spent worrying about rifle fire was a minute they weren't maximizing their combat effectiveness. In December 1944, the German Ardennes offensive, later called the Battle of the Bulge, temporarily disrupted all American operations in the theater. Tommy's unit was pulled from the Moselle sector and sent north to help contain the breakthrough. The training program stopped. Survival became the only priority. Tommy fought through the Ardennes like every other rifleman in the chaos. No opportunities for careful long-range shots at tank breaches. Just brutal close combat, desperate defense, the kind of fighting where doctrine didn't matter because you were too busy staying alive to remember what the manual said. He survived the bulge but caught shrapnel from an artillery burst on January 8, 1945. Not life-threatening but serious enough for evacuation to a field hospital. Fragments in his left shoulder and upper back. One piece lodged close to his spine that the surgeons couldn't remove safely. Tommy spent 6 weeks recovering in England, undergoing physical therapy to regain shoulder mobility. By the time he was cleared for return to his unit, the war in Europe was nearly over. Germany was collapsing. The need for innovative anti-tank techniques was fading as American armored and air superiority overwhelmed remaining German forces. Tommy returned to the 90th Infantry Division in late March 1945. His unit was in Germany now, advancing rapidly against disorganized resistance. He was assigned to light duties, his shoulder not fully healed, but he insisted on participating in the final training sessions for new replacements. In April, a week before Germany surrendered, Tommy received notification that he was being awarded the Silver Star for his actions on September 17, 1944. The citation mentioned extraordinary heroism in connection with military operations against the enemy, but didn't specifically describe the breech shot. The Army still wasn't quite ready to officially acknowledge that a private with a rifle had developed an anti-tank technique that challenged established doctrine. Tommy didn't attend the medal ceremony. He was in the field with his unit when the award was processed. Morrison accepted it on his behalf, promising to deliver it when they next saw each other. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Tommy was in Czechoslovakia when the news came. The celebration was muted in his unit, too many men lost, too much fighting behind them. The joy of victory was real but complicated by exhaustion and the knowledge that friends who should have been there to celebrate weren't. Tommy was discharged in August 1945, returned to Montana in September. He was 22 years old, had 2 medals he'd never asked for, memories he didn't want, and a piece of shrapnel still lodged near his spine that would ache in cold weather for the rest of his life. His father met him at the train station in Butte. Michael Reeves had aged noticeably during the war years, more gray hair, deeper lines in his face. But he embraced his son and said the only thing that mattered. You came home. Tommy went back to work in the mines. The Anaconda Copper Company hired him immediately, gave him a topside position in recognition of his combat injury. He sorted or supervised loading operations, trained new workers. The work was familiar, comfortable, reminded him of life before the war. He rarely talked about his service. When other veterans gathered at the local VFW hall, trading stories, Tommy would listen but contribute little. Someone asked him once if he'd really killed a tank with a rifle. Tommy's answer was brief. I hit a weak point at the right time. Someone else would have figured it out eventually. The breech shot technique didn't become official Army doctrine until 1947. The War Department's analysis section studied combat innovations from the European theater and concluded that breech targeting of enemy armor had tactical value under specific conditions. Field Manual 23-10, Sniper Training and Employment, revised in 1948, included a section on vehicle vulnerability points that referenced breech assemblies as potential targets. The manual didn't mention Tommy Reeves. It cited field observations from multiple combat units as the source of the technique. That was how the Army worked. Innovations were absorbed into doctrine without attribution, practical knowledge became official procedure, individuals disappeared into institutional memory. Tommy didn't mind. He hadn't developed the technique for glory. He'd done it because men were dying and he knew something about metal that might help. In 1952, Tommy married Sarah Winters, a teacher from Billings he'd met at a friend's wedding. They had 3 children. Tommy taught his sons to hunt, passed on his father's lessons about reading terrain and understanding how things break. He never mentioned the war unless directly asked, and his children learned not to ask. He worked for Anaconda for 37 years, retired in 1982 at age 59, the shrapnel in his back finally causing enough problems that mine work became too difficult. He spent his retirement fishing in Montana's rivers, working on his house, helping Sarah with her garden. In 1987, a military historian researching Third Army innovations in the European theater tracked Tommy down through veteran registries. The historian, Dr. Robert Patterson from the Army Center of Military History, called and asked if he could visit to discuss the breech shot technique. Tommy agreed reluctantly. Patterson drove from Washington, D.C. to Butte, spent 2 days interviewing Tommy, reviewing his drawings and notes that had survived in his personal effects. Patterson's research revealed that the breech shot had been more effective than official records suggested. By cross-referencing German unit records captured after the war with American after-action reports, Patterson estimated that American riflemen had disabled or destroyed at least 43 German armored vehicles using the technique between September 1944 and April 1945. More significantly, Patterson's analysis showed that German tank tactics had changed in response to the threat. After October 1944, German armor in sectors facing the Third Army operated with noticeably more caution, shorter exposure times, heavier infantry screens. The changes correlated with reports of breech shot attempts, suggesting the Germans were adapting to a new threat. Patterson asked Tommy if he understood the impact his innovation had had on armored warfare doctrine. Tommy's answer was characteristic. "I just wanted fewer good men dying to something we could maybe do something about. The Army figured out how to make it work on a bigger scale. That's what they're supposed to do." Patterson published his findings in 1989 in the Journal of Military History. The article, titled Weak Points: Infantry Innovation Against Armor in the European Theater, described the breech shot technique and traced its development from Tommy's initial experiment through its limited implementation across Third Army. The article generated modest academic interest but no wider recognition. Military historians appreciated the case study of battlefield innovation. Some tactical instructors incorporated references to breech vulnerability into their lessons. But the general public never heard the story. It wasn't dramatic enough for popular history, no massive tank battles or strategic turning points, just one private who noticed a weak point and figured out how to exploit it. Tommy died on November 3, 2003, at age 80 from complications of pneumonia. His obituary in the Montana Standard mentioned his 37 years with Anaconda Copper, his service in World War II, his survivors. It didn't mention the Silver Star. It didn't mention the technique that had saved an estimated 600 American lives by disabling German armor that was supposed to be invulnerable to rifle fire. At his funeral, his son Michael Jr. found a small wooden box among Tommy's personal effects. Inside were Tommy's combat ribbons, his Silver Star, and a faded photograph of a group of soldiers standing next to a burned-out Panzer IV. On the back of the photograph, in Tommy's handwriting, was a single sentence: September 17, 1944. First one. Hope it helps. The breech shot remains a footnote in military history. Modern armored vehicles have solved the vulnerability through better engineering, improved seals, redundant systems. The specific technique Tommy developed is no longer tactically relevant. But the principle behind it, the understanding that every machine has weak points, that innovation comes from soldiers who understand their tools and their targets, remains fundamental to military doctrine. The U.S. Army's current training on vehicle vulnerabilities includes historical references to breech targeting in World War II. Instructors sometimes mention the technique as an example of soldier-led innovation, but they don't mention names. The story has been absorbed into institutional knowledge, separated from the individual who created it. That's probably what Tommy would have wanted. He never sought recognition. He just wanted to solve a problem that was killing his friends. The fact that his solution spread beyond his unit, beyond his division, beyond his army, was secondary to the immediate goal of giving riflemen a chance against armor. Sergeant Morrison survived the war, stayed in the Army, retired as a major in 1963. He told the Breech shot story to every group of young soldiers he trained, always crediting Tommy by name, always emphasizing that the best innovations came from soldiers who paid attention to problems and thought about solutions. Morrison died in 1998, 5 years before Tommy. At Morrison's funeral, attended by dozens of former soldiers he'd trained or commanded, the chaplain mentioned Morrison's service in World War II and his reputation as a trainer who valued creativity and initiative. After the service, one of Morrison's former soldiers approached Tommy. "Major Morrison told us about you. About what you did in France. Said you saved lives by seeing something nobody else saw." Tommy shook the man's hand, thanked him for coming, said nothing about the war. There was nothing to say that Morrison hadn't already said better. The technique's legacy lives in the mindset it represented. Every military force trains soldiers to identify enemy vulnerabilities, understand how systems fail, exploit weaknesses that aren't obvious. That training traces its philosophical lineage through thousands of innovations like Tommy's. Small observations by individual soldiers who understood their equipment and their enemy. The documents describing the Breech shot technique sit in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland. Field Manual 23-10 from 1948, with its brief section on vehicle vulnerability targeting. 3rd Army after-action reports from September through December 1944 mentioning disabled German armor. German intelligence reports noting American riflemen targeting main gun assemblies. The documents don't tell the full story. They can't convey the sound of that first Panzer exploding on September 17, 1944. They don't capture Morrison's expression when he realized what Tommy had accomplished. They don't explain the mixture of fear and determination that drove Tommy to attempt a shot that everyone said was impossible. History remembers the generals, the battles, the strategic decisions. It forgets the private from Butte, Montana, who killed a tank with a rifle because his father taught him how to read metal. Who trained 120 soldiers to see what he saw. Who saved lives by refusing to accept that doctrine was the only way. Tommy Reeves never asked to be remembered. He just asked that the technique be used to keep soldiers alive. That happened. The technique spread, adapted, evolved, became part of the institutional knowledge that armies accumulate through decades of conflict. And somewhere in Montana, on a headstone in a quiet cemetery, there's a name. Thomas M. Reeves. 1923 to 2003 veteran. Father. Husband. Nothing about the Silver Star. Nothing about the innovation. Nothing about the 43 confirmed vehicle kills attributed to the technique he developed. Nothing about the estimated 600 American lives saved by giving riflemen an option against armor they supposedly couldn't fight. Just a name and dates. Which is probably what Tommy would have wanted. Let the technique live. Let the doctrine evolve. Let other soldiers benefit from the knowledge. The credit didn't matter. What mattered was that fewer mothers received telegrams. Fewer children grew up without fathers. Fewer friends died in burning tanks because nobody had told them there was something they could do. That was the real legacy. Not medals or recognition. Just the quiet knowledge that when faced with an impossible problem, a kid from Montana had thought about metal and angles and weaknesses, and had found a solution that doctrine said didn't exist. If you found this story as compelling as we did, please take a moment to like this video. It helps us share more forgotten stories from World War II. Subscribe to stay connected with these untold histories. Each one matters. Each one deserves to be remembered. And we'd love to hear from you. Leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Our community spans from Montana to Massachusetts, from veterans to history enthusiasts. You're part of something special here. Thank you for watching and thank you for keeping these stories alive.